easier than ever to record, but that means there's also more podcasts out there than ever. And now that scares some people away, and they say, oh, everybody and their mother has a podcast. But I think it's a good thing, though, because there are places for podcasts that maybe only get so many listeners per episode, because if you're using podcasts the right way, you don't want a big audience, but you really only want the ideal people listening. So that opens up a whole different way to use podcasts that isn't used quite as much as it could be. If I had a very specific service that I was selling, I would create a podcast just for that. And if you're not interested in that service, then you're not interested in the show, and that's fine with me.
From humble beginnings, Insurance Claim HQ has grown to one of the largest property casualty firms in the country. We didn't do it alone, and you shouldn't either. Every week, we're talking to claims professionals and top experts from all over, all to help you grow your business and make you stronger. Let's level up together. I'm Galen Hare. Welcome to the Level Up Claims Podcast. Podcasts are everywhere, literally. You might think they're in an overabundance, but know this, about 90 million Americans listen to podcasts at least once a month. That's an extremely sizable potential audience. Our guest today will tout the advantages of podcasting as a business growth tool and discuss what options might be best for you and what you need to know to start a successful one. Please welcome Jody Maberry. Jody, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
No, me too. Really pumped. We have done this podcast now for a couple of years. We never actually talked to a podcaster or a podcast producer, as you will. So you're brand new territory for us. And frankly, after a few years, it's not a lot of territory we haven't covered.
Well, great.
So before we do that, though, you have a fascinating background. You're a former park ranger. So talk to us about how you got into that and then kind of how that led to today's life for you.
Oh my goodness. And believe it or not, they're actually tied together, how I got into it and how I'm doing what I do now. I used to be a financial analyst for a commercial bank. My main job was to measure interest rate risk. That is as exciting as it sounds. I dealt in spreadsheets. I wore a shirt and tie to work. And I realized one day, it actually was when my granny died, that my goodness, I could do my job really, really well. And I enjoy it, but who's benefiting? Maybe there's something else I could do. And I managed to fulfill a boyhood dream of becoming a park ranger, which is unlikely to be a park ranger with a background in finance. And being a park ranger is as wonderful as you expect it would be. Unless you don't like the outdoors, then it's as terrible as you think it would be. But I absolutely loved it. And I was a ranger. I was a law enforcement park ranger for 8 years. I love parks today as much as I did the day I became a park ranger. So I'm always anxious and excited to talk about parks. But I left parks eventually, went back to school and got an MBA, and then thought, I still want to be involved with parks somehow. I still want to talk about parks and share what I learned in business school. And then in 2013, I had this idea to start a podcast for park rangers. There was no podcast for park rangers. And that led to talking. Well, so in parks, every industry maybe has this to some degree. In parks, we get ourselves into problems and then we just look to other parks to figure out, well, how do we fix this? So I thought, I've got this great platform. Maybe I can use it to have conversations outside of parks. What if we talk to someone from Disney about how parks can get better? I found the book Creating Magic on Amazon and I bought it, and I reached out to the author, asked him to come on the show. And I thought, okay, this guy ran Walt Disney World for 10 years. He was executive vice president, ran the whole operation. And I thought, what are the chances he'll actually come on the show? But what I didn't know his sister-in-law was a park ranger and had been for 30 years at the time. So he said, I love park rangers. Let's do it. So he was on the show twice. That led to us starting another podcast together. And now we just last week recorded episode 550 of Creating Disney Magic. And that's kind of a fast forward that led to many other shows. At my peak, I had 10 going at one time. And by now I've done more than 2,600 episodes of various shows because I've had some come and go. The Park Leader Show is still around. Creating Disney Magic is still around. The Jody Maberry Show is still around. But others have come and gone over time.
Of course. As they should, right? Like, I think, but wow, the world of podcasting has changed so much, right? Yeah. I feel like the youngins that listen, and there are some, don't remember this, but I remember when podcasts started very well, right? Because I was like, I had my iPod, which was like super expensive, and now again, kids would laugh at the price of what an iPod was back then. But, you know, it was the new toy. It was so cool. And there's and all of a sudden an update gets unleashed and there's a podcast menu. And I'm like, what is this? And you can go, but of course you got to use iTunes, right? You got to download the podcast every week. When you want a new episode, you had to download it to your computer manually. And then you had to connect your iPod and transfer the episode to your iPod. And then you could listen to it, right? Yeah. And I feel like podcasts did not take off largely for that reason, because it was so much work. But then there was like this, and then it died for years. Like, people were podcasting, but the idea of podcasts being mainstream was not even heard of. And then I feel like a few years back, all of a sudden there was like a resurgence of podcasts because it was so easy. It gets pushed to your phone, as well as a million other things. And then they were already popular, but then I think COVID just like blew podcasts up to like a whole new level because people are at home and all you can do is listen to people talk, right? All you want to do is listen to people talk, but they're kind of hard to find. And look, I mean, you had the last time you updated like your bio, you had over 3 million downloads. I would suspect it's closer to 6, 7, 8 million now. That's wild, right? One content creator here, working with other people, but still, I mean, how many content creators that you talk to get millions of downloads of real quality educational content, not talking about the most recent cat video,
Yeah, that's a great thought. And it's not something I bring up. In my bio, I'll put millions of downloads, but I don't usually talk about it much because it seems like I'm bragging. But it is interesting to think. I live in a very remote place in the far corner of Washington State, in a town of 10,000 people, and to realize that I can sit here in my office and talk, and then it ends up around the world and different people listening to it. And I will say many of those millions are attributed to Creating Disney Magic because it's a popular show. Some of the others that I do have been very niche and smaller audience, like Park Rangers, the Park Leader Show. There's not as many park rangers out there as there are people interested in hearing from the executive vice president of Walt Disney World. But it is a good point to show that it's just amazing that you can record. It's easier now than ever. You talked about how hard it was in the beginning just to listen. Well, back then it wasn't easy to record and get an episode published either. There were so many steps. And now, like, we're recording on Riverside. They've made it so easy to do podcasts. It's just incredible. That excites me. There are two sides to that it's easier than ever to listen. It's easier than ever to record, but that means there's also more podcasts out there than ever. And now that scares some people away, and they say, oh, everybody and their mother has a podcast. Well, my mother doesn't have a podcast yet, but I think it's a good thing though, because there are places for podcasts that maybe only get so many listeners per episode, because if you're using podcasts the right way, you don't want a big audience. Or, I mean, it always makes us feel good, right? To have a lot of people listen, but you really only want the ideal people listening. So that opens up a whole different way to use podcasts that isn't used quite as much as it could be. But for example, if I had a very specific service that I was selling, I would create a podcast just for that. And if you're not interested in that service, then you're not interested in the show, and that's fine with me. And here's an example that's unlike anything else I've ever done. My son is a sophomore in college, and when he left as a freshman, I thought, well, man, we're a close family. I'm going to miss him. I'm going to miss talking to him every day. So I just did what I do, and I started a podcast for him. But I put it on all the channels. It's called In the Front Row because the very first episode, my advice to him was sit in the front row. Whether or not he ever has sat in the front row of a class, I don't know, probably not. But that was my advice to him. So this is a podcast that has an intended audience of one person, and that's it. If it had one download for every episode, I would be thrilled because there's only one person that show is intended for. And now I realize compared to Creating Disney Magic and some of the other shows, this is not a lot. But I looked recently because I was curious, and that show now has more than 20,000 downloads when I only want one person to listen to it. And I've never... I barely talk about it publicly. I've never promoted it. It just somehow people find it. And it just shows that if you say something that is meaningful for one person, it's going to impact a lot of people too, because it will be relevant. And that's been a really fun experiment for me. And I thought I knew a lot about podcasting, but that has taught me even more that what if you niche down so much, you're only after a single person?
So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there, and we should start to do it. First of all, we need to find out. So I feel like you owe us, we owe you, we owe the world. You have to find out after this podcast from your son if he sat in the front row so we can update the show notes and tell the listeners, okay?
Right.
Because that's so important. I mean, you named the entire podcast after this. We need to know if he followed your advice. And if he didn't, you can tell him it's okay. I did great in school, and I always sat in the middle. You know, I'm sure he did fine either way, but that's so awesome. First of all, it's so cool as a dad that like this was your like way to continue to feel connected as he was physically separated. Right. And then I think it puts a fine point on really what the large part of our discussion today is intended to be, which is clarifying that message and figuring out who your target audience is. For instance, us, you know, and I love this podcast because I get to be very transparent and vulnerable with my audience, right? Public adjusters, contractors, lawyers. It's very easy to say, oh, he's just trying to sell his referral source, his referral ability. He wants public adjusters, contractors, and other lawyers to refer him cases. Of course I do. I like to make money. But that's not why this podcast exists. This podcast was founded because there was a lack of organization in my industry. And there are all these great business resources like you and like past guests and personal resources, frankly. We had a biohacker on once, right? And I just think it's a great way for free to bring all these resources to an industry I love who dedicate so much of their time to helping other people, right? And so I don't really care at the end of the day if the podcast leads to referrals. I'm completely aware that I can spend a lot of time and money on content, and another law firm that competes with us can throw a big dinner at a club and try to recruit that referral business. I'm still accomplishing my goal and my message, which is to help everyone have resources that help make them better. I don't care whether I get rewarded for that. I can also throw my own dinners, right? I can do those things. I can compete that way. But my message is, and it took me a while to figure this out. When I wanted to do the podcast, I had to ask that question, like, what do you want to do with it? And some of the ideas I got were a little wild, right? Because it was really about gearing every episode towards how great we are and why you should send us business. And in my mind, I was like, look, I can do that. And maybe I'll open a second podcast that does that, right? And maybe people will listen and maybe they'll send us business. But that's not the message here. The message here is, let me introduce you to someone named Jody that I found who can talk to you about really clarifying your message in the use of podcasts. Let me introduce you to someone else that I found who talks about how to keep your employees long-term and what you need to do to cater to them. Let me find you things that I believe we as an industry are lacking. And let's take those things and together be better, right? But that's a journey to get there. And you work with clients and others on figuring out what that looks like with podcasting. So tell me, like, what is the journey? Like, I call you up out of nowhere. I don't have a podcast. I want a podcast. What is your first step of advice to me? What do I need to, what soul searching do I need to do? What should be my process for figuring out who my audience is?
Well, there are a couple of ways to look at this. If, let's say, this is an example I've used a lot, and I've never seen anyone follow up with it. Not to say that somebody hasn't. This could be out there, but I live in a small town. I mentioned earlier, 10,000 people. If I was a realtor, as an example, and I said, okay, if I'm going to do a podcast, I want people to know me as like the source of what's going on. I live in Port Townsend, Washington. So what's going on in Port Townsend? So as a realtor, I would consider starting a show that is about what's going on here in town. Some pieces of history, some pieces of news, some maybe what's relevant, maybe highlighting other businesses. And guess what? When you're ready to move here, maybe you'll think of me as a realtor. So that's one piece, is to understand, okay, what is it that you do that can end up helping other people? And just like what you were telling us, that could lead to referrals, but most of it is to help people in this community. That's what I would do with the show. Now, if I'm someone, I work with a lot of former executives too, and they want to start a podcast to help build their platform.
And their platform is usually coaching, right?
Speaking, consulting, coaching, writing books, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And they want to use a podcast, which is a great platform to do it, to show their expertise. And I always say, okay, the first thing to think about, are you going to do interviews, or is it going to be just you? Is it going to be monologue style? Or there's a third style, creating Disney magic. This is what I've always called it. And as far as I know, I came up with it. And even if that's not true, I say it. I came up with it because
might as well. We live in a free world, you know.
That's right. But I call it the host and star format. Lee Cockrell is the star. I am the host. My job is to make him a star every episode, to sound wise, to be a star. His job is to say really smart things and sound wise. So we have very different roles on that show. I'm the host, he's the star. So there's another format. But if you're going to do a monologue show, okay, what questions are you going to answer? What are you going to say that's going to continue to make people that listen know that you're an authority, you know what you're talking about, you can help them? If you're going to do an interview show, what guests are you going to bring on that can help the people you want to help? Just like what you're doing, you're finding people that can help the audience that you're helping. So that's what to think about. What is the format of your show? What do you want to get across? What messages do you want to get across? And then there's other ways to use the show. Is it to build connections? Because that's a great thing to do. You're building a lot of connections you wouldn't have had without this show. Is it to create content to use other places, social media, whatnot? Is it to write a book? I've done an episode of my show about how to use a podcast to write a book, meaning you come up with an outline and then you just keep recording episodes based on your book outline. Eventually you'll fill it all in. So there's another way.
Love that.
So there are a lot of different ways you can use a show. But here's my favorite thing about podcasting, that if you have to show up every week with something to say, or you have to show up every week and have an entertaining and interesting conversation, it's amazing what happens to you. And maybe you've felt this while you've had the show, that you start to understand what you believe in, how to talk about it, how to answer questions about it. And then when you throw those networking dinner parties or those referral parties, you're way better at talking about your stuff than the person who doesn't have a podcast, who doesn't have to show up every week and talk. So there's a lot you can get out of podcasting. And I think the last thing I mentioned is not talked about often enough and is perhaps the most important piece, because it's way different than writing it down, than maybe talking it over in front of the mirror. When you have to sit behind a microphone and say something every week, it really changes your approach to how you talk, what you talk about, what you say about it. And I think that's just been the most powerful thing about podcasting.
I would agree. I think as a lawyer, I'm required to have good communication skills anyway, but it would be an absolute lie to say that the podcast hasn't greatly improved those. But you know, the other thing it does, and this isn't for everyone because everyone's personality is different, but the thing you kind of got close to mentioning with networking but didn't quite say, and I guess it partially depends on the format of your podcast, but if you have an interview guest podcast, you're meeting new people all the time. What does that mean? That means when I run into a potential referral relationship and I identify a need, I met 52 new people this year that might be able to help them fulfill that need. And when they mention they have a problem, I can say, you know, I actually just met a guy 7 weeks ago named Bob so-and-so, and he does this for a living. Would you like me to connect you to? I get nothing from that, right? But it's a nice way for me to thank my previous podcast guest. And so number one, that's good. And number two, I now have connected this potential business relationship with another business relationship that they need while I'm at this networking dinner, and they're expressing to me a frustration or a need they have. I can point them to the podcast. I can say, if you're not sure if you want to talk to him, go listen to the podcast. I'll send you the link right now. But I think this guy can help you. And that in and of itself has been great for our business, but it's really good for me as a person because I feel good when I'm able to connect people that can help each other, because I think that's kind of what everything's about, right? If you are not connecting people and helping people, cool, live your best life, but that's not my best life.
Yeah, that is such a good point. And you probably even said it better than I could. That is such a valuable piece that 52 times you've met people you might not have met otherwise. And a podcast gives you it. So let's just say you come across a book that you really like and you send an email to the author and say, I would really love to talk to you for 30 minutes. How many are going to say yes? Not many. Or just a random person saying, can we talk for 30 minutes? Mm-hmm. It just doesn't happen that often. But if you say, will you come on my podcast? It's 30 minutes long. Most of them say yes. And it's a great way to build a network. And to go along with what you were saying, one of the things people say about me from time to time is Jody seems to know everybody. But that mostly has come from, I've been podcasting for 11 years. I've had the chance to talk to hundreds of people. And not only you're talking to them, having someone on your show is almost like doing them a favor, doing something nice for them. You had them on your show and people remember that, oh, help promote my book. We talked about my podcast, whatever. And it's just easier to connect with them after. So it's just such a good way to build what you're doing, to build your business, to build a network. And you, after 2,600 episodes, you can imagine I'm just a fan of it.
Oh yeah. I mean, I would have been so disappointed today if we interviewed and you were like, I just hate podcasting. Can we talk about something else? Oh, I would have died, Jody, I promise. But you know, there's so much, and I love everything you said, because it's just so true. But you know, I think what we should hit on as our time starts to wind down, because I don't want someone to leave here just thinking, great, I'm going to grab a microphone, I'm going to do this. There's a lot of prep that goes into this. And I'll tell you what I do, but then I want to hear what you do, right? I couldn't just talk to you today. The production company gave me this cool little one sheet. I guess now that we're on video, I can show these. That's nice. I've got your bio. I've got some topics. Anyone that listens to the episodes that's involved in the production of the episodes knows I never use them because I have better things, right? I have the internet. I have books that were written by our guests. I have articles that were written by our guests. I have articles that were written about our guests. With you, now granted, I will front, I did not listen to 2,600 podcast episodes to get ready, but I did listen to 4 or 5, right? And because I want to know you, I want to know how your cadence is. I want to know what you think about things. I want to get to know you a little bit, because otherwise I feel that I am unprepared to ask you questions, and therefore I am faking it through an interview. And I noticed the more time I spend, usually the better a conversation I feel like we have. But that didn't come easy. So what would you say should be like, let's say an interview guest, because I think that's the most popular format these days. Right. Let's say for an interview guest podcast, someone sitting at home right now listening to this, they're like, yep, I'm doing it. What would you tell them is like, here should be your preparation regimen once you find a guest?
I think this is a great question. And I like that you showed part of your preparation. That is so key. I've had people tell me, I don't do any preparation. I don't come up with questions because I want it to feel like a natural conversation. And I just don't agree with that, because there's a difference coming up with questions. So yes, you can come up with a list of questions and stick to them and not vary anywhere. Maybe that wouldn't work as well as you would hope. I called that prepared questions. It's better than nothing, but what I really like is coming, instead of having prepared questions, to come prepared with questions. Because coming prepared with questions means you've done your homework, means you know a little about the person, you were curious enough to write down questions, and you may only ask the first one, and then the conversation takes off and you never get back to the others. But the fact that you did all of the work to come prepared with questions means you are more likely to have a better conversation. And if you need to, you fall back to that list of questions. And I even have a way I like to prepare. I'll give you a short version of it, is that I will read articles, read books, listen to podcasts, go through social media, and I just get out a yellow legal pad and write down any question that comes to mind. Then when I'm done preparing in that way, I go back to those questions and I will rewrite them in an order that when they're answered, because I kind of know what the answers will be because I just did all that research.
Yeah.
I will reorder them in a way that when they're answered, then a story unfolds. Meaning we start with the beginning, we hit some challenges, then we'll hit a peak, and then so you understand what the answers might be, and then you can order them, your questions, in a way where a good story unfolds through it. And now, even after all this time, I could probably do any interview with no preparation, and I still choose not to. I still choose to prepare for every interview because, one, it's a sign of respect. Two, it's a way to just show that I care, and I may miss something completely that would have been worth talking about if I didn't do any sort of preparation. So that is such an important piece of doing interviews, is when you schedule a guest, yes, you might have 30 minutes on the calendar for the actual conversation, but then at minimum, schedule 30 minutes a few days before to do the preparation, because it will lead to such a better conversation. And you may find 30 minutes isn't even enough, because you'll get going and you'll realize that people are so interesting. Gosh, 30 minutes, I can jot down some questions, but there's so much more to dig into.
Yeah. I mean, and it's really about what you want to put into it, right? I mean, for me, if you're an author, especially if you're plugging a book, I'm going to read the whole book, which sometimes hurts depending on the length of the book. And, I would say how easy, like I made a mistake, and I won't call him out because he's a lovely human, but I'd had an author on once about a book, and it was a very short book. So I brought him on a second time, like a year later when he released another book. And it was a great book, but a very dense book. And I mean, his first book, I read fast. I knocked it out in like 2 hours, 2.5 hours. So about 2 days before the podcast, I picked up this book, and an hour in, I canceled everything I was doing for the next 2 days so I could finish this book. But it was a great book, and I was ready to talk to him about it. But, so I'm not suggesting you must read every book, but if, you're coming on, especially if you're going to talk about your book, I'm going to do you the courtesy of having actually read it. Because, and again, for those of you sitting at home thinking about podcasts, these authors will actually give you, many of them, podcast notes and questions for their book so you don't have to read it. But then all you're doing is asking the same questions that 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 other podcasts are going to ask them about that book.
Yeah. And the reason that came about is most authors, after being on a couple shows, realized that host didn't read my book and it didn't lead to a good conversation. So authors now understand a host is not going to read my book. I better prepare them with some background, with some questions to make it easy, because I can talk about these questions very easily. And that's the key to being a good podcast guest, as well as to be prepared for an unprepared host. It happens more than I would like it to, that guests or hosts are unprepared, but it makes such a difference for an author, and they love it when you've read their book. So I'm sure you have delighted many authors that have been on your show, where they show up and you actually read the book, you understand the book, and it really makes a difference in the conversation as well.
Well, thank you. Look, Jody, I really appreciate your time. We are running out of time. But before you go, I have to ask you, as you know, what does it mean to you to level up?
Oh, level up. That is a wonderful thought, because I think if you're going to level up, you have to have enough self-awareness to understand where you are right now. That's step one. And then what can I improve on? Even if it's incremental, what can I do next? And that's it. It's just the next right thing over and over. And it all starts with self-awareness. You can't level up if you don't truly understand where you are right now. And then from there, you can listen to podcasts, you can start your own podcast, but just continue to move one step further than you are right now.
I couldn't have said it better myself. I appreciate you. We all appreciate you, Jody.
Thank you so much. It was great talking with you.
Likewise. I'd like to thank Jody Maberry for joining us on the show. What an interesting look into the world of podcasts, even if super brief. This is a man that has a wildly successful business podcast, but also created a podcast just for his son. And as you can tell, even a small message for a niche audience will reach more people. So find your message, figure out who you're looking to talk to, and have at it. Follow us on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player.